Now we're going to look at a problem. Let's press play and let the cinematic play, but watch what happens when I'm in my game view and I start trying to run around. So my cinematic is playing, and you can probably see what's going on with my robot on the left-hand side. It's just going along and doing all kinds of stuff, bouncing over here and dying, not staying where I want him to, which is generally what you want to happen during a cinematic. You don't want the rest of the game kind of going on and things happening. So we're going to add a way for our game to semi-pause when a cinematic is playing. Specifically, we're just going to lock down the player's movement, but we could stop anything that we want. If we want to control and stop other things, it's very easy to add that on. Let's go to the level 1 intro and figure out how we're going to do this. Right now, we only have access to our virtual camera, but we can access pretty much anything in our scene. If we try to use our players, though, and do something directly to the player, you're going to find that we have a problem because we can't access things that aren't in our scene yet, and our players are instantiated. At runtime, they can die, they could be recreated. Things could happen to them. We can't guarantee that we're going to have a reference to them in our timeline. So instead, what we want to do is reference our game manager and tell our game manager that a cinematic is playing or that a cinematic has stopped playing. And the easiest way to do that is to go down into our timeline. So I've got the intro selected. Go right click and choose a new signal track. A signal track is going to allow us to create an object that we can kind of link up on our game manager or any other objects and listen for an event and then fire off some code that we want to run. I've got my signal receiver field right here, so I'm going to take the game manager and just drag it down and then choose create signal receiver on player input and game manager. It's going to create a new component on there. If I go over to this object, you'll see that I now have a signal receiver. I could also just remove this though and just hit add component and just type in signal receiver. It does exactly the same thing. It just needs to have one on there. If I go back to the timeline, you'll see that it removed it because I removed that signal receiver temporarily, so it was no longer a valid object. So I'll just go redrag it and reassign it. Now I want to add a couple of signals. The first signal is going to be when a cinematic is starting. I want to make sure that I can stop the player from moving. So I'm going to do it first by just right-clicking here and choosing Add Signal Emitter from Signal Asset. We don't have a signal asset, so I'm going to choose Add Signal Emitter instead. That's what I meant to choose. And then we're going to go over to the right-hand side and we're going to hit the Create Signal option. That's going to allow us to create a new signal that we can use and listen for in our game manager. I'm going to create this in the cinematics folder, and I'm going to call this cinematic started. So now we've got a cinematic started emitter that's going to fire off, or a cinematic started signal that's going to fire off right about here. If I go over to my game input manager, you'll see that now I have a signal receiver or reaction listening for the cinematic started event or signal to fire off. I'm going to add another one. This time though, I'm going to do it on the opposite side, on the game manager side, because it does exactly the same thing. And I just want to show that you can do it from either side and it doesn't make any difference. We're going to hit add reaction here. We're going to choose from the drop down, and instead of choosing none, we'll hit create signal. This is kind of the way that I prefer to do it anyway. I'm going to go into cinematics and we're going to rename this to cinematic ended. That should create a new one, and we've got now an empty list here with nothing firing off. So now what's going to happen when we run through our timeline? Let's go select our timeline intro. Right now we're going to fire off a cinematic started and never fire off a cinematic ended. So let's go add that real quick. Right about here near the end, we'll right click, hit add signal emitter from signal asset, and I'm going to choose cinematic ended. And then we're going to go back over to this game manager. And in here, what we're going to do is just set a Boolean to true or false based on whether or not a cinematic is playing. And we'll just do that in our game manager. So we'll open up our game manager. We're going to create a new Boolean and a new method to set that Boolean. Let's make a public void. Let's call this toggle cinematic. And then we'll give it a Boolean parameter. So cinematic playing. And then we're going to make this an expression body, so just do the lambda statement, and set a public variable named cinematic playing. Did I spell it right? Cinematic playing equals the lower score cinematic playing. I'm going to go over to cinematic playing and just left click on it, hit Alt Enter, and generate a property for it. That should give me a public property that's got a private setter, and I want to make this static so that I don't have to reference the instance. I know that there's only ever one of my my game manager around. I don't need to get into that. So I'm going to jump back over to our player script now and make sure that when our cinematic is playing, we just don't move our player. To do that, I'll take all of our code inside of our update that's for movement. So I guess everything after line 82, and we'll wrap it in an if statement. We'll say if game manager dot cinematic playing is equal to false, then we'll run all of this code, which looks like a great spot to extract. So we need everything down up to the update animation. If we are playing a cinematic, we still want to update our animation in the direction. I think that's probably fine. I think the final step here is to just take this big chunk of code from line 85 down to 129, hit Alt Enter and extract method and call this update movement. That's handling all of our movement, and I think that it makes our update method a whole lot more readable and manageable, and it looks a lot better. Let's do a build with Control-Shift-B. It looks like it works. We'll jump back over to Unity. Now our signals are going to need to be set up really quick. In our signal receiver, we just need to choose for cinematic started. We're going to use Game Manager, and let's see if I can get this onto the screen. We'll just drag it over here. We'll go to Game Manager, and we want to do Toggle Cinematic, which is also off screen. So we're going to drag that up as well. Let's see. We'll do it just like this. So we'll go Game Manager and Toggle Cinematic. And when it starts, we're going to say true. So we'll check that box. And then when it's ending, we're going to do the same Game Manager, Toggle Cinematic, but then leave that unchecked so that it sets it to false. We'll save. I'm going to go select that level 1 intro, hit play, and then let's watch what happens as I now try to run around and as my cinematic starts and ends. So here I try to run, I'm hitting the arrows going left and right, nothing's happening. And I'm just going to hold this right arrow down until the cinematic ends. And as soon as it did, you can see my player started running. You might have noticed one other thing though. Let's stop playing and play one more time. And watch what happens if I just click. I can still shoot. So this could also be an issue. And I'm going to leave this as a quick little challenge. Go ahead and make the little one-liner code change so that our blaster stops shooting when a cinematic is playing. I'll leave you to that, and then you can continue on. We'll wrap it up and commit. All right, I'll assume that you've done it, but if not, the fix for this is going to be relatively simple. We don't need to overcomplicate it. We can just go directly into our blaster, which is still a pretty simple script, and just fires off an object with no reload or no refresh times yet. And inside of our use, we'll just check to see if our cinematic's playing and just not fire off if our cinematic is playing. So we'll say if game manager dot cinematic playing is equal to false, then I'll tab in that fire statement and do the fire. So we'll only fire if we're not playing a cinematic. We should probably add a reload time and countdowns and all that stuff, but for now, this should fix our problem. We'll jump back in, we'll do a real quick test before we save and commit. So play, and then start clicking. No shots, no shots. I'm clicking away. You may not be able to hear it, but I'm clicking as loud and fast as I possibly can. And there go the shots firing off right afterwards. All right, let's stop playing and we'll go back into plastic and it's time to commit. Here I'll say that we added cinematic mode to the game manager using signals. And we'll check it in.